Hi everybody, Stan Stolberger. Time for this week's Middle East update. It's the week of November 20th, and as we look to the future, let me be one of the first, hopefully, to wish you a happy Thanksgiving. So let's remember to make sure you grab the PDF PowerPoint for this presentation. It accompanies the YouTube. But what is going on in Israel? We usually start with our news bites. And did you know that President Trump actually mulled striking Iranian nuke sites in what now is being determined his final days in the presidency, and was talked out of it by his top advisors? But once again, it just makes us refocus on what's truly going on in Iran today. We have an article here about red lines, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that slide. Bahrain, the foreign minister of Bahrain visited Israel, and both countries have agreed to open embassies by the year's end. And Bahrain's embassy will be in No, not Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. Well, Mike Pompeo became the first U.S. Secretary of State to visit the Golan Heights, as well as other West Bank settlements. His quote, "You cannot stand here and stare out at what's across the border and deny the central thing that President Donald Trump recognized, that this is a part of Israel." We've been on many tours with our friends that run a Jeep tour company right up on the Golan Heights, the Syrian border, and I'm pretty certain I'm going to get some information concerning that trip, because I'd be surprised if he wasn't with our friend. Also, Pompeo announced, and this is kind of a bombshell, this is probably the most important thing that's come out of this visit, that the U.S. will allow products that are produced in so-called Israeli settlements to be labeled with "Made in Israel." Now, this is going to send the BDS off into outer space. There's going to be explosions all over the place, especially with the so-called squad of far left liberals in our Congress itself. So stay tuned. We'll see how all of this sort of pans out, because basically Pompeo was saying we will stand against the BDS. It is anti-Semitic. Well, also, while he was in the Golan, obviously not during this exact time, but the Golan Heights, the Israeli Defense Forces last Tuesday uncovered and disarmed a number of explosive devices that had been planted inside the Israeli-controlled territory in the southern Golan Heights near the Syrian border. The explosives were planted in a so-called buffer zone along the border where Israel once maintained a clinic for treating Syrians under the humanitarian program called Operation Good Neighbor. We know right where this is at. It's overlooking the city of Quneitra, and the fact that, well, you'll see in this next article, this is not something that Israel will take lightly, or has not taken lightly, because in a rare occurrence, Israeli officials publicly confirmed that the country's military, remember, this was discovered on Tuesday. On Wednesday, the IDF launched airstrikes against the Syrian army, and perhaps most notably the Iranian Al-Quds forces in Syria. Now, we've gotten mixed information concerning the casualties, but the point being is that this is a so-called red line, and Israel does not erase those red lines. And with what's taken place on that border, there was an immediate retaliation. Just keep that in mind. as we now talk about red lines, more red lines. H.R. McMaster's, President Trump's former national security advisors, issued a warning, and we need to hear this. He issued a warning on Wednesday night, that Israel could attack Iran if it detected a threat emanating from it, even in the final days of the Republicans' administration. We've been saying over the last few weeks, we've been talking about these red lines, and the closer that Iran is getting to a nuclear weapon, and by the way, listen carefully, while the world was watching and is watching the political controversies in the United States over Trump and the election, etc., that we may have missed a very serious report that emanated from the International Atomic Energy Agency. They have pointed out that there's a rising threat from Iran. The reckless regime now has more than 12 times the amount of enriched uranium if we were still under that 2015 nuclear deal. Bottom line, they're not stopping. They've slammed their pedal to the metal in trying to get as much uranium in the centrifuges ready for nuclear grade weaponry. Israel has made it clear, we will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. It is another red line. So this warning that even, how far away are we from that? Let's just let that sort of soak in. Know also that Trump, we already said, he's already thought before his presidency ends, if it does end in January, that we may take a strike at Iran as well. Interesting times, that's for certain. Al-Qaeda, very embarrassing, of course, to the mullahs in Iran, that the New York Times reported on Friday that Abdullah Ahmad Abdullah, who is Al-Qaeda's second in command, who was responsible for the 1998 bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, was shot and killed on the streets of Tehran by two Israeli operatives on a motorcycle. It's stated that this Al-Qaeda terrorist, this mastermind, allegedly was taken out in Iran by Israeli agents at Washington's bequest, and that he was planning attacks on Jewish and Israeli targets at the time of his death. That's the report. That's what's taken place in the heart of Iran. Mossad. I got a sweatshirt that says Mossad, and then underneath it says, it wasn't an accident. And then we have the hypocrisy of the Palestinians. Each week we can bring something up. But the Palestinian Authority claims that it's against terror everywhere. But there is one exception: when Palestinian terror targets Israelis. Two similar incidents illustrates this. Listen carefully. When a Palestinian man recently helped a victim during a terror attack in Austria, did you know he was awarded a medal by the PA chairman Abbas? And everyone sung his praises. But when another Palestinian and his wife helped an Israeli terror victim who had been shot and they were still in their car, that this couple is receiving death threats. He was fired from his employment, and they're ostracized by the Palestinian society. Gotta love it, right? That's that peace partner. If you've followed KFIR over the years, you know how in high regard I hold Carolyn Glick. And so when she's writing She writes for Israel Hayam, Israel of Today. I usually take note. And so when I came across this, I thought I'd share it with you all. Standing with the Palestinians is a party position for the Democrats. That's why Obama's former ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, told the Israeli media that the establishment of a Palestinian state will return as the strategic goal of the Biden administration. A strategic goal. And then he goes on, likewise, appeasing Iran and giving it an open road to a nuclear arsenal is a domestic political issue for the Democrats. We've just talked about the red line. We've talked about nuclear weapons in Iran. And now we're dealing with this whole two-state solution and the hypocrisy of the Palestinians. Mark my words, it will be what was it called? It will be the strategic goal of the Biden administration to divide the land of Israel and to divide Jerusalem and make East Jerusalem the capital. We'll have to wait and see about that. And I wonder what the Bible says. Well, when we see Biden and his joking and his personal warmth, and this idea of soothing the nation and healing the nation, and we've got moderates versus radicals, and these are sort of soothing distractions for Israelis. But as Carolyn Glick says, we are about to face the most hostile U.S. administration against Israel in our history. It's a perspective of a Jewish writer. Well, the UN condemns Israel, no big surprise. In Israel, the UN stands for United Nothing. Last week, the UN General Assembly's Fourth Committee passed 7 resolutions condemning Israel without mentioning any transgressions by any other nations. There's talk about what they're doing on the Temple Mount, or the resolution also condemned Israel for constructing the security wall. I love that phrase, security wall. In actuality, 90% of the security wall is a chain link fence, right? And then talk about hypocrisy. Are you ready for this? Syrian President Bashar Assad, who's caused chemical weapons, he's turned chemical weapons against his own civilian population, in whom it's believed that at least 100,000 civilians' deaths incurred over the 9 years that this civil war has been going on. This same guy, Bashar Assad, he is the one who co-sponsored a resolution which decried the economic and social repercussions of the Israeli occupation on the living conditions of the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and the Arab population in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. Bashar, are you kidding me? Well, you know the answer to that, no. And then we have CNN's infamous Christine Anapor, going on record on the night of broken glass, the beginning of the Holocaust. She compares the extermination of 6 million Jews to the internal American politics, effectively comparing and saying these are both the same. The night of broken glass, which began the Holocaust, and Trump's 4 years in office. Israeli officials were shocked, and they demanded CNN, they took them to task over this, demanded an apology. And of course, just yesterday, Christina Amanpour apologized. I'm sure it was heartfelt for any pain she might have caused to the Jews in this comparison. No words. Israel's reopening. There's an article here that's about two what they call green islands that are opening up, tourist islands, Eilat and the Dead Sea. But I just got this from our friends in the land of Israel, on the land. Israeli authorities have begun early planning towards the resumption of incoming tourism to Israel by mid-December 2020. So mid-December 2020, it looks as if the doors or the skies may be reopening. Please keep that in your prayers. And then I'm out of time, so got a little treat for you. You can look at the COVID Thanksgiving proposals from New York and California. So with that, God bless you. Again, happy Thanksgiving and shalom.